Hi Zana, hi everybody.
Hi, Van. How are you?
I'm pretty good, thanks.
So, what does your field of linguistics entail?
Well, these days, most of my research and a lot of my teaching focuses on sign languages and
Mhm.
sign language linguistics. Although that's not really where I started out, I've worked on all kinds of different things, and I guess I kind of think of myself as a bit of a jack of all trades. Trades. I try to do a bit of everything.
Many other classes other than just sign language.
That's true. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but I could tell you a little more about sign language linguistics and the things I currently mostly do. So in the Caribbean, for example, there are lots of different sign languages.
Yeah.
And we kind of know that, but there's been hardly any research on it. So in many places, especially places like, well, actually, most places, but I'm thinking places like Guyana and Suriname, where they have, huge countries with lots of people living in more remote areas, in rainforest areas or whatever. We just have no idea how many different sign languages there might be in those places, um, what kind of experiences deaf people are living in those places. And so a lot of my work at the moment is really to do with that, trying to understand just how many sign languages we have in the Caribbean, how they're used, how people communicate, what deaf people's lives are like.
Yeah. And try to publicize that. So, what's your general view of linguistics and its importance of your field? I mean, we can assume, but we'd like to hear from you.
Well, of
But
course, it's the most important thing in the world, obviously. Um, I guess one way I would think about it is I think linguistics is one of those things that should be general knowledge, but mostly isn't.
yeah,
So there's lots of basic things that we know as linguists, which I think should underpin whatever anyone else is studying. So if you want to understand the Caribbean, you have to understand the languages of the Caribbean. You have
Mhm.
to understand how they work, but you have to understand also the way people think about languages. So, for example, if you're interested in the Caribbean, you have to know a little bit about Creole languages. And you have to understand, for example, that Creole languages are not broken languages, are not insufficient. In fact, they're the perfect and natural mediums for all kinds of things that Caribbean people do, like uh, education, going to school, like government, providing public information, all of that kind of stuff. So I feel like linguistics is important because languages are at the heart of what everybody does in their daily lives. And there's lots of kind of basic information and basic misconceptions that linguistics should be trying to dispel and spread.
Yeah. What career opportunities are there in your field?
Well, there's a shortage of sign language interpreters
Mhm.
in Trinidad and Tobago and in the Caribbean. In fact, in some ways, we're a little better off here than some other parts of the region.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. I guess doing this now on Zoom, we're very aware of how much things have changed in the last year. And one of the things that has changed is I think people are much more accustomed now to seeing sign language interpreters. If
Yeah.
we'd done this a year ago and people had seen Niobe on the screen there interpreting, they might have been a little surprised. But I imagine that they're not anymore because every time you have, well, hopefully, most of the times, when you have the updates on TV, at least here in Trinidad and Tobago,
Yeah, the official.
when you have, yeah, the official communications, more and more now do have sign language interpreters. And not only that, we have lots of deaf interpreters working on the TV as well as hearing interpreters. So there's a demand for that. And in particular, I think there's a demand for better quality interpreters. I think sometimes people see, oh, there's an interpreter on the TV, that means it must be accessible, but it's not necessarily.
No,
It might be that the interpreter, and I know this because I've been that person, it might be that the interpreter is not very good, not doing a very good job.
yeah,
It might be that the way the screen is set up is not sufficient.
yeah.
So we need better and more interpreters, but we also need translation of information. So that means at the moment, the government puts out all kinds of notices in written English.
Yes.
And they might be posted through different channels, through Facebook and whatever. But written English is not necessarily accessible to everybody, and certainly not necessarily accessible to deaf people. So we need people to be translating those documents and that information. And at the moment, that's something that there are groups doing that for free, groups of deaf organizations who are working on that. But that, again, that really needs to be a profession. People need to be paid, there need to be jobs. So there's lots of things like that, lots of opportunities like that. Chiara mentioned app development as well. And that's, that there's all kinds of possible uses of technology within the world of deaf communities and sign languages that could be really, really useful, and really opportunity for entrepreneurship amongst people who have the linguistic knowledge and skills.
So what inspired you to become a linguist?
Yeah, and again, like Chiara, I have a long version of the answer to this, which I will spare you for now. And probably people who've already taken my classes have heard versions of this going back several generations. But I guess the two things that I can think of that stand out in my memory. One is I was doing my degree in England, and I was studying linguistics for the first time. I didn't really know what linguistics was at that time, like, you know, like most of you all as well.
I started with linguistics.
Yeah, because you don't do it at school. And I remember in my first year class on syntax, the place where many people get inspired, hopefully. I remember the lecturer quoting a famous poem. It's kind of nursery rhyme. It's by the person who wrote Winnie the Pooh.
Right.
And it has this line in it about this bad man, bad King John, and all he wanted for Christmas was a big red India rubber ball. And I knew this poem because my mum used to read that to me when I was small.
Right.
And the lecturer pointed out something about that to me that I had never thought of before, which was that you could say a big red India rubber ball, but you couldn't say a red big India rubber ball or an India rubber red big ball. You couldn't move the order of those words around.
Yeah.
And somehow we all know that, and yet nobody ever teaches that to us.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that I guess introduction to linguistics classes around the world teach you. But for me, even now thinking of it, it gives me a little buzz. Just the mystery of how we know our own languages, and the fact that that's true whether you speak English or a Creole language or a sign language or whatever. All those languages, if you're someone who grew up using that language, you have all of this stuff that you know that you might not even realize you know.
Yeah.
And do I have time for my second part, or shall I be quiet?
You can go ahead. Let's hear it.
The second thing that happened to me that changed my life was I was sitting in a bar in Japan. Actually, I wasn't sitting, I was playing darts.
Okay.
And at the time I was teaching English in Japan. I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life.
Right.
And as I was playing darts, there was a guy next to me who was also playing darts. There were two boards set up. And so we were just practicing together. And then he approached me and he started talking to me. And we spent the whole evening actually drinking and playing darts together. Met for the first time that night.
Right.
And it turned out that he was deaf. And for that whole evening, we had this long conversation and we didn't have a language in common.
Right.
I'd never used Japanese sign language before. My Japanese was awful. He didn't use English. And yet we communicated about all kinds of things. And we became, over time, we became really good friends. And I started learning Japanese sign language. But that moment just changed my life forever because it opened my mind to things that I didn't know were possible. And especially the fact that I could go from nothing. I didn't have a language in common with this person and immediately communicate. And understanding that, I guess, has been something that I've been trying to do for years since then.
So what would be your favorite part of linguistics, since you are so well-rounded? What are you most passionate about? Or is it
Well,
just a general linguistics on a whole?
well, I feel very, very lucky and grateful that I have found my way here to Trinidad and Tobago and here to the Caribbean. If people don't know me, they might be able to tell by my accent that I wasn't born here. I was born in England. Um, but for me, my favorite part of linguistics as a person living and working in the Caribbean is how relevant it is to everyday life. It's relevant to everything. You see it everywhere. So it doesn't matter if you're thinking about sign languages, you see it everywhere. You see it when a deaf person is in court and they need to communicate. They need to have their, their basic human rights observed in a court setting. And I've found myself in a situation like that. And linguistics has things to say relevant to that. Or you see it every time you walk into a school in Trinidad and you see the way in which language is used in the classroom, sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously, very unsuccessfully. You see how people navigate the use of Creole and English, and you see it across the region as well in different countries. So for me, the great thrill of linguistics is to be a person in the Caribbean. Linguistics is everywhere. Linguistics is vital, and linguistics has things to say about everything.
I just want to take this time to ask everybody that's watching that if you have any questions for Ben, if you can send it now in the chat. I know I missed one for Dr. Matthews, but I will get back to that one when I'm done with Ben. So my last question for you, apart from any that get sent in the chat, is what are some difficulties in your field, apart from the obvious frustrations that you go through?
Is that obvious?
Yeah.
Difficulties? Well, I guess I could interpret it different ways, but I guess I could talk about one of the things that I see happening a lot in my work is that local languages are sometimes not treated with the respect that they ought to be. And I'll talk about this in relation to sign languages. So in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, we have a sign language, TTSL, Trinidad and Tobago Sign Language. And that comes from here. That was created here by deaf people here, deaf children mostly in the first instance, and spread throughout the deaf community and some hearing people too. And yet, still sometimes in deaf schools or amongst hearing people who learn to sign, they learn American Sign Language.
Right.
And that can be a problem because although there's fluidity and there's contact between those languages, that can lead to what's local, at worst, disappearing.
Yeah.
But it's not really disappearing, it's being forced out. It's being crushed. People talk about language endangerments and languages disappear. They don't really disappear, they get crushed by some power structure. So if, for example, schools are determined not to include certain languages, then that's the reduction of those languages happens as a result. It's not just, an accident.
Yes. Okay.
So that's frustrating.
Yeah, that is very frustrating. And that happens not only with sign language, but with a lot of languages just all around the world. And we don't even, things that we don't even know that are happening. And then there are people like you who are aware that it's happening and you're trying to help it to stay relevant.
Yeah, and I guess mostly the most important thing is people like you, the next generation of people, and especially people, people of and from the Caribbean. There's only so much, I always feel there's only so much I can do as a person who didn't grow up here and has learned what I have learned in the last 13 years. Yeah. But what really makes a difference is all of you, hopefully. And that's what can change things like languages disappearing or language discrimination or all of those problems.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to say thank you. And if we have any other questions in the chat that come up, I will be summoning you back to answer them. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to ask Dr. Matthews to come back for a quick minute so we can ask her these questions that we have today.
Yes. Hi.
Hi. So one of the questions that was asked was, Did you complete all of your SLP training here in Trinidad?
I did not. I started back in, when was that? 2009,
Right.
when UE was offering the bachelor's in speech and hearing science. However, I found out maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the first semester that I got a scholarship. So I decided I would have taken the entire year at UE and then I transferred out.
Right.
I got my bachelor's in communication sciences and disorders at Howard University. I got my master's at Boston University, and then I completed my clinical doctorate this year at Northwestern University. And that's because there are no programs, no entry-level programs in the Caribbean, but that is hopefully soon to change. Right, Dr. Ferraro?
Amen.
And our next question is clinical linguistics for stroke patients as well?
Yes. So clinical linguistics will help stroke patients, especially those, because not everyone who has a stroke loses some kind of language or cognitive function. But
Right.
yes, stroke patients, cancer patients, head neck cancer patients, brain injury patients, people who have different
Dr. Matthews, I'm not sure if we broke up there for a second. Okay, so she got bumped off. Okay, so moving on to our next speaker, I would like to call Kristian Ali, who is our post-grad representative. And she's going to be talking to us today about her field of linguistics and how she got into it. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. So what does your field of linguistics entail?
Okay, so I'm an MPhil student in linguistics at UE. I guess you could say I'm in the field of sign language linguistics. My thesis is on a tactile sign language. So sign languages, when people refer to sign languages, they usually mean that visual language that is produced with the hands and body and perceived visually. But there are languages that are used by people who are deaf and blind. And we call those tactile sign languages because they are produced with the hands and body, but they are perceived by touch. So yeah, and so you touch the other person's hands and body to perceive. So this language is called Bay Island Sign Language.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a language that I was part of a documentation project to document this language. It's used in two very small islands near the coast of Honduras. And for at least 100 years, there have been deafblind people living in at least two very small villages. So this is a very small language community, but very unique, very interesting. Language has never been documented before. So I was there for 3 months with Dr. Braithwaite and Ian Danulal, who is in the audience, as well as Kimon Elvin. So yeah, so that's my broad field and my thesis topic.
Gotcha. And are you enjoying it?
Yes.
What is your general view of this field of linguistics and its importance?
Yeah, so important. the field of sign language linguistics has done so much important work, and Dr. Braithwaite will have spoken a lot about that, obviously, but I can add on some things. So he wouldn't have mentioned that sign language linguistics really has its origins in like the 1960s, which
Right.
actually isn't very long ago. And it didn't really even take off until like the 70s, the 80s. And that was when linguists really started paying attention to sign languages. And not even all sign languages, just like American Sign Language.
Really
And
big.
yeah, and I mean, in those few decades, 80s, 90s, there was a lot of work on American Sign Language to prove that it was an actual language. So imagine the field of sign language linguistics isn't even that long, and like half of it has been spent to prove that these are real like languages. So now in 2020, we know that sign languages are real. And when we say real, we mean they have the same linguistic structure that spoken languages do. Yeah, so we don't have to keep saying that in linguistics now. But you do have to say this in, well, when you're in public, right, outside of linguistics, because people still think, oh, there's one sign language and it's like gestures and it's based on English and, you know, it's not real. But yeah, so the field of sign language linguistics has, like, all of the research that has been done in ASL and then, you know, later on, all these other sign languages all over the world, because there are so many, we don't even know how many there are at the moment. It's really been important for, like, boosting the status of sign languages and that deaf communities use, and therefore boosting the status of deaf communities and deaf people's lives. So sign language linguistics has, like, fueled social and political movements all across the world by deaf communities to say, my sign language is equal to your spoken language, therefore I am equal to you.
Right.
And I deserve the same rights that you do. You know, I have the same human rights. So I would say historically, the field has been extremely important, but there's still so much to do. So that's why it's important to keep going, keep studying. And also for tactile sign languages, as you can imagine, there has been a lot less emphasis on deafblind people and their languages. So that's even newer. So I would say within the past few years is when we've started getting more research about tactile sign languages as they're used by deafblind people all over the world, and the importance of recognizing them and validating them, making them official and whatnot. Yeah.
So what are some career opportunities in this field?
So I can speak for myself as an example, maybe. So I'm a sign language interpreter.
Right.
I do TTSL to English and vice versa. TTSL shouldn't be a sign language. And Niobe, who is interpreting right now, she has been an incredible mentor for me in making me a better interpreter. But I mean, apart from that, there is just so much you could do, because when you think about it, language is part of your everyday life, and every single field we need someone who knows about linguistics in it. Doesn't matter, like, if you do computer science or psychology or natural language processing or speech and language pathology, we need people who know about linguistics. So if you always wanted to be a language teacher, you could be a language teacher who knows about linguistics. Or if you want to be an interpreter, you'd be an interpreter who knows about the linguistics of the language that you're interpreting for. Or you can be an activist. I think Ben would have spoken about language endangerment and discrimination. We need people who are speaking up about things like language discrimination, because we might have people with linguistics degrees, but I feel like we're not being listened to, Like, language is all caught up in various forms of discrimination, racial discrimination, class discrimination. Language is entwined with power and how power plays out. So we need people who are advocating for social justice there. We need people who are going to write our policies to know about linguistics.
Yes.
Because we have very archaic policies, right? And so we need language awareness and linguistic awareness to be written into those things, into how we, structure our education system, etc. And this is for spoken and sign languages, for us as Creole speakers and for the people who use sign languages. There are people who work on, like, I think Kiara and Ben spoke about like apps. We could work on, if you're super interested in technology, you could work on digital tools for language documentation, language revitalization. You could also, if you like writing, you could become a science communicator. So this is actually a major invisible field. Invisible in that people do science all the time, they do research all the time, but it sort of stays in this academic cloud and it doesn't always reach the public. So we need journalists who have a background in a field like linguistics to write about the research communicated to the public. So like all these articles you see online about, I don't know, the newest scientific study where, you know, where they say a study found that XXX, like those are people who probably majored in their field or like had a master's in physics or something and said, I'm going to write about it. Because that's so important. It's not just to do research, but to communicate about research. Otherwise, it might be for naught because you're not communicating. You know all of this about linguistics, but you're not communicating with the public. So we need those people. So if you have a BA in linguistics, you could go on to be the next like linguistic journalist in Trinidad or something like that. That's super important as well.
Dr. Matthews is saying in the chat, preach.
Yes.
So what inspired you to become a linguist? What was like your first aha, this is why I'm gonna do it?
I feel like I had various moments when I was an undergrad. One moment related to my research was when I went on a field trip, and field trips are like the best ways of having aha moments, I find. So I went on a field trip with Ben and Ian and the rest of our class. We went to Togo to meet, I think we went to various parts of the country on a very small maxi, and for one day. I don't think we ate or anything, but it was worth it. We went to like just show up at people's houses and like say, do any deaf people live here? Or like we heard there was a deaf person here, we want to speak to them. And I thought that was a bit like shamefaced moment, but it was great because we met people where they were and we got to see like how they lived, what their lives were like, right? We just like bombarded them with all these questions as like students of sign language linguistics about like what they feel about their language and their experience in education and whatnot. And everyone was just so happy to chat with us. And
find somebody they can talk to.
Right, and someone like who cares about all of their problems, especially when you live in a rural place, like all the services are centered in the city and whatnot, but people in rural areas also need their voices to be heard. And I feel like that field trip was when I realized I don't know how, but I want to do this for the rest of my life. I just want to talk to deaf people and ask them about their lives all the time and how can I make that into a career. So that was like sign language linguistics aha moment. And I think when I was doing phonetics and phonology, interested in phonetics and phonology, I had Dr. Kian Wilson as my lecturer. And I remember she said, I can't remember, maybe it was sociolinguistics, but anyway, she was the lecturer and she said like, okay, go home and for homework, like you're gonna think about, observe how you speak. And I was like, okay. And then by the time I came back next week, like I had discovered so much about myself that I had never ever known. I didn't know that the way I speak and the way I actually think I speak, it is so different. And that was aha moments as well. And then from then on, my life has changed because I'm constantly analyzing how everyone speaks. I'm constantly looking at how people sign, like how they sign to different people, like what variation they use. I'm that guy. So since the switch has been turned on years ago, it hasn't turned on. So that was my like linguistics moment as well. Yeah.
So if anybody has anything to ask Kristian, now is the time to put it in the chat. And your last question from me is, what are some difficulties in the field?
Yeah, so I think so there's something called we call autism, right? Autism is like this belief that hearing people are superior to deaf people, right? And it's linked to the belief that speaking is better than signing. And you would not believe, like, autism is rampant. People don't acknowledge their internal autism or whatever, but it is a form of discrimination that we've all internalized, and we have to like discuss it to combat it. You know, why do we think sign languages are inferior, and why do we think spoken languages are superior, or whatever? And you know, you find that autism is important to talk about because it's this invisible killer in like the workplace. It's in the workplace, it's in education, it's in our policies. So people still think today that it's better if deaf people speak, you know. So I think autism is a direct link to not being able to get a lot of things done successfully. Is a reason why you would say like sign languages maybe are underfunded, like sign language research is underfunded, or sign languages aren't used in the classroom for this reason, because with all the linguistic like knowledge we have, we still think it's better if deaf people speak, or spoken languages are better. So that is one thing. The other thing I would say is, I know Kiara said something very interesting about, no, you said in relation to Kiara about having to borrow foreign materials in doing like foreign models for SLP and stuff like that. That's super interesting because it's sort of the same thing in lots of fields of linguistics, subfields of linguistics in the Caribbean, because we kind of, whether we know it or not, borrow like a foreign model of doing research on languages in the Caribbean. In sign language linguistics, I think we have to understand what other people do, like in North America and Europe, but we have to understand how the context is different for the Caribbean. And there are signing situations in the Caribbean that actually look very different from what is happening in the US.
Yeah.
My thesis, the language my thesis is on, that situation that looks quite different from what has been described before. So now we have to think about the suitability of our like research methods for studying Caribbean languages. And just because like the Caribbean context culturally, historically, you know, linguistically is so different, that's important to think about as well.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge with us. If anybody has any questions, I will call you back.